Howdy folks, today we're going to take a look at HTML and URL entities. What are those, you might ask? Well, sometimes there's certain characters that mean something. For example, the greater than, less than for HTML. Or in the URL, we've got our ampersand, our question mark, and equal sign, which have special meaning. But you also may want to put those characters in your URL or your HTML. So HTML and URL entities are how we do that. Let's get into it. So to get started, I have a simple document here. It has a form with a password, and then, with great security, I tell it what the password is. And then some section with some math equations that's hidden by default, and then it's copyrighted. It's important to copyright your work. The script is pretty simple. It just grabs the search out, gets the password, and if the password is equal to this, then we accept and let the person in. Or let them view the equations. This is a simple example, but you can see how this might be important. Okay, so let's start off. I'm just going to copy my password here. Put that in there. Okay, now that doesn't look right, but before we get to that, I want to take a look at what happened here. Let's just grab this, and we'll kind of put it down here. Form does this automatically, but you can see that looks very different than here. We've got the hello, and we've got the bye, but everything in between is kind of strange. Now the reason is, let's say that it looked like it did before, something like this. That's going to confuse the browser a lot, because the browsers can see, okay, password equals hello, and it might even get the question mark okay. But it's going to get to that ampersand, and it's going to say, oh, we're done with the password, because the ampersand is the divider that lets the URL know when the next parameter is, and it's going to say, oh, okay, bye equals nothing. But that's part of our password, and you can see that's not an unreasonable password to have, actually. Because you could imagine a password having special characters in it, like an ampersand. And so what happens is this actually gets transformed. So the question mark turns into %3f. The ampersand turns into %26. And the equals turns into %3d. You'll actually notice this a lot with spaces as well. So if I go back here and I do some stuff and I put a bunch of spaces in, you notice those turn into pluses. Now that's a special way that the browser has of just saying, yeah, there was a space here. The other thing you might see is something like %20, which is the entity for a space. So these are ways to encode these, and the browser knows whenever it sees that % there, the next two characters are going to tell it what the entity is. But you might wonder, how do I put a %? Well, the % is %25. Right? So if you see the %25, that actually decodes into a %. You can actually figure out what this is. If I just go here and I look for, okay, URL decode. And there's a URL decoder encoder. I paste that in, I decode it, and you can see, or if I encode it, it goes to that. There's also some functions that you can do with this as well. So let's say I need my test string and by. I can actually encode this by calling encode URI component or encode URI. There's slight differences between them, but most of them will be okay for whatever. Test string. So this is because, so the form did this for us, right? And that's the reason I'm showing you this. The form did this for us because forms will always handle that because they know that they need to encode, but maybe you're building a link yourself for an anchor tag or something, and you want to have this in there. So if you need to encode it yourself. And so now, let's inspect this here. And you can see there's our encoded data. If you want to decode it, it is decode URI component. And it does essentially the same thing. Long decoded. And now you can see it's decoded it again. So this is an important thing because you may get encoded URLs. Now, usually the browser takes care of it. Like you notice we passed this in the URL search parameters and the password just came out perfectly fine and we didn't need to do anything about it. But if you do get something that's encoded or you need to encode something, these are the functions that you can use for that. Okay, so now we put that in, and that doesn't look right. That's not the equation. This is our equation. So you might notice something odd about this. That's x less than 5, or 5 less than x, y greater than z. But we're getting 5z because the browser thinks this is an HTML token. We don't want it to think that. And you can see if I actually go and inspect this here, make that a little bit bigger, you can see it actually thinks that that's a token. And y is a parameter of that. And then you can see it's created the close parameter for us because it got to the pre. And it said, oh, you didn't close your x. Okay, well, I'll just close it for you. Not great. Well, what do we do then? We got to show this. Well, the browser has a special way of doing this. And that is HTML entities. So for this particular one, I'm going to put ampersand LT, semicolon. And you can see, look at it, there's a lot of them. And this one, ampersand GT, semicolon. And if we run that again, there's our things as we expect them to be. Well, what changed? Basically, this ampersand tells the browser in the HTML, we're about to give you a special character. Okay? We're about to give you something that is going to be special and you need to deal with this. So the LT afterwards says, hey, this is a less than. This is going to be a less than, the actual less than character. I don't want you to treat this as a tag. This is the actual less than character. Same here, greater than character. Okay? Similar with this copyright, we can do ampersand copy. And note there's a semicolon, and there's a couple of these. See, there's copy SR and copy. And now has that official copyright symbol. There's a bunch of these. So there's also the trademark, trade. And if you look, let's see. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here. Tons of things that the browser supports. Like up T arrow. What's that? I bet that's pretty cool looking. It's this little up arrow. Any Unicode character can actually be represented this way. Now for most of these you don't need to. Like I could actually copy this trademark symbol here. And I could actually just paste that in and you can see that's a normal. It's a little hard to see there actually, but you can see I've pasted that in there. And it shows up just fine. Same with the copyright, etc., but we didn't used to have those as easily, so that's what the HTML entity was for. It's very commonly used for this because as soon as you have less than or greater thans in your program or in your HTML, you can start to have problems. Now, if you're doing something like set text content, the browser's usually smart enough to know that it needs to turn those, that's text. It's not going to be HTML. If you're using inner HTML, you may need to escape them. That's what we would call that. And there's a bunch others. So like I could look, for instance, HTML entity for small dot. And it says dot symbol, bullet point. Okay. Now look down here. You notice this is Unicode. Okay. And there's a Unicode thing. Notice it's got that ampersand, that semicolon. And then it's got a hash X, which tells it, hey, this is going to be, or pound X, that's going to be a Unicode character. So maybe I put that in there. And there's that little dot. You think that's maybe not very useful, but the important thing about these, like let's say that arrow, right, over a picture is it's a font. You can make it bigger, smaller, much more easily. You can change its color. And so there is definitely a case for having sometimes arrows or special characters. One of the common ones I've seen is like if you're putting something in French or Spanish on your page as like maybe a translation, you may need to have something like that. So for example, HTML entity for N with line above. I know it's called the Enye, but I can't spell it. There you go, Latin capital N. Well, that's with a dot. Oh, here it is. Unicode character. That's, oh, N tilde ente. There it is. So I want, where is the character case for it? And you can see it's about, okay, lowercase m with tilde. Here we go, HTML. There's my hex code, there's my HTML code, there's the HTML entity. So if I need to put something in, like maybe something doesn't work with this too well. One thing I have seen this be a problem with is if you're inserting data into the database and sometimes it doesn't handle certain French or Spanish characters, then you can actually replace them with these special characters or HTML entities, which are standard Latin characters, but the browser knows they represent that special stuff. Again, the browser is usually pretty good with Unicode at this point, but in case you may need to put this, maybe you need to send this in plain text to something that doesn't handle any non-Latin characters, this is a way to make that work. So, to recap, if you have that %sign in your URL, in your parameters here, that is a URL entity. That there's a bunch of others, but these are the common ones. Let me just put space. %20. We don't see that one as much because it can turn into other things. But you can see these are control characters, so they normally be pretty important, and you can't just put them straight in the URL without confusing the browser, so having them as those encoded characters helps out a lot. Most libraries and systems take care of this for you, but the reason it's good to recognize is if you see something like this, you should recognize that these are encoded characters and this is not the actual value you're going to get out. And then you need to run it through a decoder to see what it actually is. Then, for HTML, this is the most commonly used, the less than and greater than. Because if you want to show a less than or greater than, you have to do it like this in a lot of cases, or else the browser thinks you're starting an HTML tag. These other ones, copy and trade, I've also seen used pretty commonly. Stuff like these is much less common and I would say more situational, but it's still really important to be aware that this is a thing that you can do, because if you run into the situation where you're going to need end tilde, then you're going to need it, right? There's no way around that. So anyway, I hope this is helpful, and I'll see y'all next time.